Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Thom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. And wow, I don't even know where to begin. This is episode 22. This is a very special guest. So for the longest time, I've always wanted to do a podcast, and I thought to myself, you know, this is something I've never necessarily done. I'd hosted a show called Rundgren Radio about my favorite radio, or not radio guy, but my favorite musician, Todd Rundgren. And then I thought, you know, but wait a minute, before that, I had been on an early version of a podcast with a guy named Robert Harding. So my first foray into podcasting and online, well, I guess it was called online radio back then, was with a gentleman by the name of Robert Harding. And some people say, well, I use that term loosely, but Robert is truly a gentleman and an old dear friend. Unfortunately, he moved away for the area. Unfortunate for us. I think he's a credit to journalism, and I don't know, we had some good times back in the days, and you know, we actually wrote for the same newspaper together for a period of time, and we were the liberal voices in a conservative forest. So anyone turned off by progressive liberal thought, that's okay. We're not going to get too deep into the politics. I mean, we will a little bit, because I don't pretend that I'm something that I'm not, but I don't think I'm really the kind of person who just likes to kick hornets' nests or whatever. But that being said, without further ado, as the French would say, Mr. Robert Harding, it is so good to see you via Zoom and hear your voice. How are things?
They're going well. It's good to be with you. I've loved listening to the podcast. I'll admit I haven't listened to every episode, but certainly a good number of them at this point. I'm getting caught up on some I missed, and you know, it's nice to be a guest and nice to see you again. You know, we were talking before we went live here, or recording anyway, about, you know, those early days and the online radio, as they called it at the time. And yeah, it's those times helped prepare me for the life ahead. So it's good to be with you. It's good to see you, and you know, I hope things are going well for you.
Well, you know, aside from literally getting off of a COVID isolation at midnight last night, it's been a week. But yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot about those days, and kind of you know, just for people that don't really know the backstory, you know, try to not. I know sometimes when you talk to people you haven't talked to in a long time, that you forget that there's listeners out there, but just to kind of catch people up. So Robert and I were writing for a newspaper that's now defunct, like so many newspapers, called the Medina Journal-Register. And I wrote a column that was called The Real Deal from Orleans County, because I thought that, you know, I was going to change the world, and, you know, and wanted to write these kind of tongue-in-cheek columns and whatnot. And Robert I think at one point, I don't know that we didn't alternate columns, but I know that there was a couple of times we tried to get into the investigative journalism when it came to the county that we were in. And, you know, Orleans County, I mean, it's redder than red. I mean, they're redder than the Soviet Union was back when they existed. I mean, it's just very Republican. So we tended to really stir up the ire of the opposition. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the people and whatnot that we dealt with. But I got to the point where I had to make the decision if I was going to continue writing political pieces, and I just couldn't do it because of the threats and difficulties in obtaining employment and things like that. So I shifted towards music writing, which is where I've been since. But you continued with the political writing and the political coverage and things like that. And you did it outside of the area. So I said, I'm glad that you can do it, because it is your full-time vocation. But I think you have to admit that if you're going to write about politics, you either got to be really thick-skinned and do it for a living, or, you know, you can't do it, because it really does permeate your entire life in terms of people get super offended if you write something that they don't agree with.
oh yeah. I mean, it's I actually had an experience this week with a campaign that was less than positives, shall we say. And, those experiences are not rare. They are, and I'm talking Democrat, this particular campaign that was upset with me was a Democratic campaign. There's Democrats and Republicans over the years that have been upset with me because I'm sure we'll get into this, the evolution from, what I did in the days that we were running together to where I am now. And it's quite a change, but it's one that, I'm happy with in that I'm not politically active necessarily. I still vote, but I'm not out there helping campaigns or anything like that. But I'm covering those who are politically active. And I think those experiences did help me because I know the landscape pretty well. But yeah, it's a profession, covering politics that you definitely need to have a thick skin, or at least a thicker skin that you're able to, on any given day, take the blows, because they're going to come either from an ordinary Joe or Jane that doesn't like your writing for some reason. They might disagree with a point in a story or something, or a candidate or a campaign or an elected official that doesn't like that they were the subject of a piece that might be less than positive. So yeah, it's politics has always been a passion. I'm living that out in a different way these days than I was, say, 15 years ago, or even longer than that. But still love it to some degree. I mean, I think I've certainly found other passions in writing as well. Just kind of random investigative stories. I wrote about a mobile home park recently, which was interesting. Things like that. So, but politics will, and I think forever, be a passion in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think it's, in my case, it's a very conflicted relationship, because I love presidential politics. I always have, except for maybe the last couple presidential election cycles, which I thought were just nonsensical. It went from, a chess match to wrestling matches. And I think you touched on some things too, is that, as an op-ed columnist, yes, I had a certain bent. And I think even society today has gotten to the point where they think that anybody that writes a column has to be this sort of neutral voice. But the reality is that anybody that writes anything, whether it's about music, a mobile home, or politics, I mean, there's a human being there, and there's experiences and all that comes with it. And for some reason, they expect people to be able to check that at the door, but you can't do that. But I also found too, as much as people go, oh, you're a liberal or you're a conservative, blah, blah, blah. And you think, well, if I'm a liberal, the conservatives are going to come at me. And if I'm a conservative, vice versa. But the reality is, like, when I ran for office, and I ran for office in Orleans County 3 times for a county legislator, that I had just as many problems internally with the local Democrats that I did with the Republicans. So not only do you deal with the external forces, the people that are in the opposition party, but you have to deal with kind of the internal mechanics within your own party, because they say, well, you got to toe the line, you got to do this, you got to do that. And it's the same thing. It kind of goes back to journalistic integrity. Am I writing because of something that I believe in, or am I writing something because I'm getting pressured to write things this way? And I don't know. To me, that was always the biggest issue, is just people trying to manipulate what I was doing in terms of my expression. So that's a lot of the reason I stepped away as well.
Yeah, I for me, it was, as I was in college, when I got involved, really in politics, and, Democratic politics specifically. And, I had similar experiences as you did. You run into certain people who don't want you to say certain things. I remember, of course, living in New York when the 2008 presidential election was happening, and everybody in New York that's a Democrat was like, oh, you have to support Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And I did not. And I was a big Obama fan at the time, and that did not sit well with a lot of people. And, I remember wearing I had this Obama fleece that I got, and I wore it to the Democratic Rural Conference. And the looks that I got, like most of these people at that point did not know who I was, but man, they knew who I was after that, because they hated my guts that I would walk in there without Hillary gear on. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was, after going through that, and Tom, you wouldn't believe how many times I was told, oh, we need to get you a job. We need to get you a job. And then, nothing ever materialized with that. And it taught me, like, your trust in those in politics should be, a bit restrained because they won't necessarily deliver on any sort of promises. But I think for me, it was a time where I was like, I have this passion, but is there a way I can carry it out differently than being involved in politics in a direct way, helping campaigns or working on a campaign, working in an elected's office. And for me, that was journalism, because I had a passion for writing. And, I started out, usually the career trajectory is that you write opinion stuff, later on, after you've established yourself. But for me, thanks to Mike Regan, the former editor at the Journal, he gave me that chance to write opinion stuff right out of the gate. All it took was a letter to the editor, coincidentally. So, but for me, it was like, okay, I've got that out of my system. It's time to, kind of get serious here. And, that's what led me to Auburn ultimately was they had a job opening here for an online producer. And I was hired here back in 2009. And, this was after my dad died too. I know you remember this. It was a tough time for me then. And, it was the recession was in full, at full steam, and it was hard to find a job. So, I was already in that mode. Like, I want to get away from this politics stuff in this way. I don't want to work on campaigns. I want to do this differently. So when I was hired at the Citizen, one of the things that was mentioned, in my interview, and then after I started there, was, doing this political blog, which I still write today, Eye on New York. And I actually wrote a column, during COVID. It kind of went away. I still write stuff, on the weekends, but I had a Sunday column called Eye on New York as well, that wrote about different political issues. My first column I remember was about then Senator Gillibrand and some bills that she had, and the possibility of a primary for her. And I've tackled a bunch of different issues along the way, and I've covered a lot of different campaigns. I will say that my past involvement in Democratic politics posed a bit of a problem right out of the gate there, because when I tried to cover politics, there was one particular Republican candidate, congressional candidate. I wasn't at that point. It's 2010. I'm not too far removed from the days of writing columns in Orleans County for the Journal, and open to the public radio and those things. So it was easy to find all of that. And I had I basically was told, like, yeah, he's not going to talk to you. And I was like, what do you mean? It was like, well, we found some concerning stuff. I was like, okay, but, I would really like to explain myself if I could, and I know today, if that would happen, there's no chance, of that I would, make those inroads with anybody, because just how our political climate is today. But this particular candidate named Richard Hanna, who went on to win his election and served a few terms in Congress, he's like, yeah, I'm willing to talk to him. And so we had a frank discussion. And I told him, like, look, that's in my past. I know that it's not too long ago, but, I really want to do good at this political journalism thing. I want to be objective. I want to, write fact-based journalism. And so, so he heard me out. And after that, I covered his race. He won. I covered him when he was in Congress. And I've covered many others since then, and it hasn't been an issue. And I think it's, on the basis now that I have a pretty good portfolio of, what I've done in the last dozen years or so. And that's been, for a lot of people, some of the stuff that I wrote or recorded back, in 06, 07, 08, doesn't even exist anymore. One of the blogs I wrote for is defunct. All of that stuff that I wrote is gone, which, actually, I remember several years ago, I was like, gee, I know I wrote about a couple of these subjects that I'm writing about now. I'd love to go back and see, what I wrote then. And it's like, oh, there's no archive. I was like, okay, that's lovely. Same thing with the Journal. There were some stories that I wrote for them that, I was like, gee, like the situation on Maple Ridge Road in Medina with Tim Hortons and Aldi. I wrote about the need for a turn lane. The state DOT said, oh, they need a turn lane in there. And we know that there's not a turn lane in there today. And I was like, I wrote about that. I'd love to find that story. It doesn't exist anymore. So it's been, it's been quite a ride, but, I'm proud of where I am now, and proud that I'm, beyond, kind of the opinionated politico stage. And now I'm, more focused on, let's give people the facts, kind of an old school approach, and let them decide, let them have the opinions. I think that's an approach that's needed in this climate. Some people don't like that even, but I think a lot of people respect it, which, for me is a good thing. Proud of my work over the last 12 plus years.
Yeah, I think it's like anything, you have to find an audience. And I guess the tough part is whether it's a podcast or, your blog or any of the thing that I've written, at some point you have to accept the fact that an audience exists for you. I think that the thing that I always found difficult is that in as much as there were people that liked what I did, liked what you did, or whatever, whether it's, again, the podcast column or whatever, you don't really hear from those people as often. I mean, I try to make sure that if I listen to something or I see something, even if I get good service at a restaurant, I say thanks, because I know that on the other end, it seems like the nasty people are the ones that are the most vocal, and they kind of get into your head. So, and the repercussions on my end, I mean, even just from running the column and running for office and everything, I mean, it reverberated right up until I had been hired at the YMCA in Medina, New York, which is Orleans County, which is where you're from and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I still have connections there and everything. And when I was there, after they had hired me, Chuck Nesbitt, who was the former county, I forget what the heck his county chief administrative officer, I think was his official title, but like a county executive. And then at the time, the guy that was the head of the county legislature, Dave Callard, they both called the board members and told them to fire me after they hired me. And I was pulled into the office and told about this phone call. And I'm just thinking to myself, my God, here it is X amount of years afterwards. And you can't get past it. And yeah. I'd had conversations with them in private, and I thought everything was good, but man, they were still out for blood, and it worked out for them. I can't really talk about the specifics of that particular position and what happened with it, but it was some pretty ugly stuff. And but those are the kind of things I think, unfortunately, in politics that people get really intimidated. He said, and now it gets to the point where you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you have an opinion, people say, you're this, you're that, you're the other thing. And then if you present facts, they say that it's an opinion. So it's it goes back to that kind of thick-skinned stuff. But I'm with you. I think there's a part of me that still likes the political process, understands the importance of it. But it also, I also scratch my head and go, well, when will common sense prevail in terms of even like, so let's say in a district that I live in, and I don't know what it's like in Auburn, but I imagine it's the same. Like you look at New York State, and most of these elections at the state level are not competitive. It's not like it's not like there's any real democratic process. It's Steve Hawley, who is a guy that I know, who's our representative in state government. Great guy. I like him. Love to have a beer with him. I don't agree with his politics and some of his grandstanding. I get it because he's, catering to the crowd, but he's under no threat of losing his position. So he can say whatever the heck he wants. And I think that has become the case so much across the state that you don't get kicked out of office in an election anymore. Usually it's because there's some kind of scandal. And I feel like they find those scandals, they can find it on pretty much anybody at some point. So if they want you out, they're going to figure out a way to get you out. So, I mean, that's going to make it interesting for you too, to kind of, look at the stuff going on in the background of how New York State politics is. But I don't know how you do it without getting really jaded.
Yeah, it's tough because you see why people would want to sit it out. That they don't want to vote, they don't want to run for office. I will say, here in Auburn, we're in Cuba County, so it's a county of about give or take 75,000 people. The city of Auburn makes up about a third of that, again, give or take. And so we have several towns. And I can tell you, we just had a local election last year, and many of those races were unopposed. And to me, that highlighted two things. One, that, not a lot of people are informed about what's happening at the local level, because in a lot of ways, that's the most consequential level of government. That's where your property taxes are decided, and, various other policies that affect you directly. And yet few people go to those meetings, and few people know what goes on at those meetings, because, papers like ours don't have the resources anymore to cover, every level of government. And then, from an electoral standpoint, you see, there have been some local races where they've basically had to find someone to appoint to positions because no one ran for them. Like, that's how bad it's gotten. So I definitely see that in my job, that, you see people that are on the other end of it too, that they're passionate about it. They either run for office themselves, or they're involved in helping campaigns. They volunteer, they pass petitions, they, come election time, they're going on, walks to knock on doors and stuff, and all the power to them. I think what they do is admirable, but you can see what they're up against. I've tailed some candidates, several times now, and you just see, like, some people are just oblivious to who the candidates are. A lot of that is, due to the lack of coverage, in some areas, media coverage, I should say specifically. It's some people just don't care. So it's a real battle. And but yeah, I've seen it at all levels. From races for Congress to races for town board. There's definitely a level of I guess apathy, but even more than that, people just are like, well, how does this affect my daily life? And if you can't convince them how it does, then they're like, and they move on.
Yeah, I see it as intimidation. I think it's all intimidation. And again, that's based on my personal experience. I can't say that I have any grand study that I've taken and everything, but based on my personal experience, at least in Orleans County when I lived there, and I don't live there any longer, which is why I can say the things that I say and name the names I name. But, it's like there was such an intimidation factor. I remember so now I ran for this county legislator position. I didn't win the person I ran against, and I made some strides against. But, I mean, I had a guy pull me aside and have a meeting from the Republican Party and said, hey, if you don't run the third time, I'll guarantee you a seat on the town board in the town that you live in. Which to me is like, how are you going to do that? I don't know if he was being legit or not. And I know that other people that I'd run with as Democrats and been offered deals, and then the deals didn't come through, because it's not like you get it in writing, But,
right.
But it's so the seat that I ran for, the guy that won it, he won it after me, and he was a Democrat, and he had beaten the guy who was the former chairperson in the legislature, and I knew they wanted him out, and now he runs unopposed. And there was even a point where somebody in the Republican Party wanted to run. It was the son of one of the guys that was on the county legislature. And then magically he just didn't run. And the only reason they don't run anybody against him is because they know that they'd be threatened with a lawsuit, because we threatened them with a lawsuit at one point if there were no Democrats on the county legislature. So they literally put a Democrat on the county legislature to avoid a lawsuit, but yet nobody sees this. And the reality is, even though that there is a lone Democrat on that particular body in the county area, they're chosen by the Republicans, because the only reason they're there is because the Republicans chose not to run against them. And and I look at that and I go, man, it's bizarre. And then going back to the other thing you said with when people run unopposed, I mean, imagine if you had a job where there's no threat of you getting fired. Like, what do you have to do to earn it? What do you have to continue to do? You don't have to show up. You don't have to do anything. I mean, the situation with, who was it? Chris Collins, right? That was in the insider trading.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that guy win?
Yeah. I mean, I think,
but it goes both ways too, because I want to qualify that, because, Marion Barry was a Democrat, and he was smoking crack cocaine with a prostitute, and they got it on video. Yeah. And I feel like, if I was running a campaign against Marion Barry, my campaign would be, "Hi, I'm Thom Jennings. I don't smoke crack cocaine with prostitutes. Please vote for me over Marion Barry." Right. I mean, how do you lose that election? And I point to that one and I go, man, you know what? When I start to feel bad, at least I'm not the guy that lost to Marion Barry after he was caught smoking crack cocaine with a prostitute on video.
Yeah.
And I don't know, the guy that ran against Chris Collins, Nate McMurray, I mean, I met him before he ran for Congress and after he's lost to Chris Collins, and he's become a complete lunatic. Like, he is just completely unhinged. He's going nuts. And, I feel bad for the guy because, like, I get it. I'm thinking, I'm running against a guy who's insider trading. I mean, nobody's going to care if I'm a Democrat. And then you lose in it. But it goes back to that whole thing we were saying about politics, where at some point you got to scratch your head and go, who are the people that are voting? What is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I can say, and I won't name names, because there have been people in the where I am now, who they've been accused of things that are, or they've been charged even, and somehow they keep their seats. And I know that the Collins example comes up a lot, because it's like, we know the outcome of that case now, but I mean, those were serious charges at the time. And, I think if he was in a district that wasn't as red as he was in, he would have been doomed. But I think that provided him a buffer, because I think what happens a lot, and this is just based on my observations over the years, and both parties are guilty of this, that they view it as, well, that guy might be corrupt or, a criminal or something, but we'd rather have a corrupt insert party here than have this other party in office. Because the thought is that, in some cases, take the most recent example we have, Brian Benjamin, the lieutenant governor, is a Democrat. He resigns, and there's a whole thing about, how this is going to work with the ballot or whatever. But, at the end of the day, if Brian Benjamin is on the ballot with Kathy Hochul in November, if he makes it past that primary, let's say, if his name gets advanced, I don't know how it's going to work with potentially replace him on there. I guess there's a way they could do it, but let's say there isn't, and he somehow wins that primary. Are Democrats going to be like, oh, we're not going to vote for, really you're voting for Kathy Hochul. Are you not going to vote for her because of Brian Benjamin? Probably that's probably not going to influence your vote that much. In the primary, it might, because New York's kind of quirky in that the lieutenant governor runs separately from the governor in primaries. So it certainly will affect him now. He's, I think he's doomed for that. And of course, he's resigned from office, so he has no interest in the LG's position right now. But, for me, it's an example of, well, let's say this happened later in the calendar and Hochul and Benjamin were on the ballot, because we've had an example of this before. Alan Hevesy, back in 2006. Hevesy, these details emerged like late in the race. It was kind of an October surprise, I remember. And, Hevesy was in real trouble, and he won his election anyway. And what happened was I think he resigned in December after that election. And that's how we ended up with Thom DiNapoli, who's now our longest serving statewide elected official. So it's to me, it just shows that, and both major parties are guilty of this, that as long as it's their guy, it's their guy. And they're going to ride or die with them, so to speak. And, if they win, great, because then they say, well, at least we have our guy in there. And if not, they're like, in certain cases, like in that congressional district in Western New York, it's like, well, let's say McMurray were to win that, they know that they can get a Republican that comes back 2 years later that beats him. In that district. So, it's a temporary loss, not a permanent one. And so they, but it is, it's amazing in our politics how these ethical issues, these legal issues seem to matter less. There are some exceptions. I mean, I think what Andrew Cuomo did is an example of, just bipartisan outrage. Like, we can't have that in government. And, they forced his hand, which is, a crazy thing to say about Andrew Cuomo, who, never had his hand forced for anything. And, he resigned. But, all in all, I think most elected officials in certain positions where, they may have ethical lapses or legal issues, they try to see if there's a way they can survive. And in some cases it works for them.
Yeah, the Andrew Cuomo thing, that's to me it's just a fascinating tale. But he's a guy that lived by the sword and died by the sword. And I think that, in all fairness, not to get too into the opinionated aspect of politics, but he did a lot of great things. He really did. In terms of the legislation that he was able to get through, he did some really important things in terms of wages. He made an increase for salaried employees that was significant, minimum wage increases, a lot of things that I think helped common New Yorkers that he probably doesn't get credit for. And the only way he was able to do it was because he was a bully. That was his style. And unfortunately in New York State, I think that's kind of comes with the territory a little bit. I think, but I think his paranoia, he was almost like Richard Nixon like in the paranoia. And so I think that's what ultimately kind of did him in, or maybe lack of a wife that could stop him from sexually harassing other women. But, any number of things. But either way, it's like you said, the double standard. Chris Collins kind of gets away with the insider trading thing, which he really did, because he eventually gets pardoned and he's really not doing any jail time. And I'm sure he really didn't have to pay back any significant amount of money. So his family's probably doing really well. The Republican Party, even though they had 2 or 3, I think they had 3 in a row that had to resign in disgrace for that congressional seat. Do you remember? It was because you had the shirtless guy, what the heck his name was.
Yeah.
And then who was the one before him?
You had
I thought there were 3 Chris's that all got in trouble as Republicans in that particular congressional seat.
Well, they elected a third Chris Jacobs to that seat. He hasn't gotten in any trouble.
But who was the first two that got it? It was Chris Collins and Chris Lee. So so we had the 3 Chris's. So not only did they have 2 Chris's that got into trouble and had to leave office in disgrace, they actually added another Chris just to say, hey, we can do what we want here, folks. What I mean? It's just
the third Chris is the charm.
The third Chris is the charm. Yeah. Hey, just in case you guys forgot, the people that we ran before that had political scandals, their first names were Chris. And now our new candidate, his name's Chris too. So, and I don't know Chris Jacobs. I've I think I've run into him a couple places, but I don't really have opinions of him either way. But the point is, it's not exclusive to Democrats. It's not exclusive to Republicans. Like you said, there's an old expression about, hey, he may be a bastard, but he's my bastard. It doesn't really matter in politics. And right. I think it's sad, but I don't know. Well, let's go down memory lane, since we've spent 34 minutes just going back to the old days of talking politics and whatnot. One of the things I think we were like early adopters of was this sort of online hate. I mean, we were well before Facebook existed, and people would do things online, and now it's sort of an accepted thing where you go, oh wow, look at these mean comments online. Do you remember that crazy cast of characters that we had to deal with? Now, we wrote for the Medina Journal-Register, and they had what was called a forum. And a forum was, I don't even know if forums exist anymore. I think they do to a certain level. But before social media was a big thing, I think maybe there was MySpace. You had these forums, and people could come up with fake names and just type horrible, rotten, evil, masterful, crafted, things and spread rumor and spread gossip and all that other stuff. Now, I have my personal favorite master of hate, but I'm just wondering if you remember any of the masters of hate from back in our days in the newspaper writing. Go ahead.
I sure do. I sure do. I remember at the Journal, actually, when I started as an intern there, one of the I guess jobs I was given was to monitor the message board and or the forum, as they called it. And I was like, okay, how active could this be? And I learned this later on. It's always the same small group of people. We make comment sections, as they're called today, and even in like the Facebook comments on various stories, it's always made out to be like, oh, there's this large majority that are voicing these opinions, and it's like, oh no, it's usually a handful of like the most venomous people you could meet, and
with like 9 different screen names.
Yeah, that was a thing. They kept changing. I forget which one was guilty of that, but I remember that was a thing. Like, you'd ban one, and then they were like, oh well, I'll just create a different email address or a different username using the same email address and go from there. But yeah, I can remember that, because a lot of especially on days when either of us would write columns, I remember that the forum would become a little bit more active those days.
Oh yeah.
It seemed that some and occasionally, which I don't know what this says about us, but occasionally they would agree with something that we wrote about local government. But then, most times though, there was always like, these guys can't be trusted. We must attack them.
Yeah, my two favorite. Well, Mad Mark was, I won't say his last name because he's such an egotistical scumbag that he would just enjoy it. And knowing him, he'll probably listen to this because he's just that into himself, and he still stalks me to this day. But I can't block him on enough things. I mean, this guy is whatever. So, but I'll tell you a funny story about him in a moment. But our friend Scott, who has since passed away. And Scott was, the funny thing about Scott was, for those listening, is that Scott could not spell to save his life. I mean, this guy, when he wrote, he just could not spell anything. So he could come up with 35 different profiles and write, and he used to try to do the devil's advocate thing, where he'd come in and pretend that he was disagreeing with you, even though he was agreeing with you, so that you would go on and get into an argument with him to show that, I don't know. It was bizarre. And I miss Scott on some level. And obviously he passed away at a young age, and he was in a wheelchair and everything. But man, this guy was like so active in politics. But when it came to the forum, it was utterly bizarre. It was a strange experience. But this guy, Mark, so funny story is that One day I was working at Hillside as a teacher, and this young lady had just started as a teacher's aide, and she came in, and I introduced myself, and I said, "Hey, I'm Thom Jennings," and this young lady comes up to me and she says, "Oh, my name's Marky," and then gave the same last name, and I look and I go, "Man, how could like that be so close?" And she's giving me this weird look, and I go, "Do I know you?" And she goes, "No, you know my dad." And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "Your dad is Mad Mark?" She's like, "Oh my God, don't hate me." And it was really funny because she was a sweet girl. I mean, I don't understand. I mean, she must have had a very sweet mother or something, because she had entirely different disposition than her dad. But here's the weird part. This is where we start to get into bizarro territory. So one of my kids has gotten into some legal trouble many years ago, and Scott found out about it, and he was mad at me about something. This is why we weren't talking when he died. I don't know if you know the story or not. So when he died, right before he died, we got into a huge argument. I just cursed him out because I knew he was the one that leaked the information to Mad Mark about what had happened with my son. And I remember thinking, because this guy, Mark's daughter, had told me something that was potentially really embarrassing about her. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm not going to stoop to that level. And that SOB, man, he should be thankful that I'm not that guy. But I'll tell you, those were those kind of ethical and moral dilemmas that you faced every time you get into an argument with these people, because it goes back to that being thick-skinned. People say something about you, they say something about your family. And as much as I still get offended when people say something about me, man, you talk about my kids, I mean, gloves off. I mean, you're a recent dad, so you're probably going to experience that at some point if anybody ever, I mean, hopefully you don't, but somebody says something about your kid, it's like, man, not good.
Not going to end well. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, it was weird. Back then, it was like everything was so faceless, where even though you knew who it was, so, Mad Mark was this guy named Mark. I mean, because he was smart enough to use his real name and his screen name. And that was sarcasm, by the way, folks. But there was still a degree of anonymity. And what always surprised me is I thought that, at least in the early days of Facebook, that if you had your name associated with a particularly vitriolic comment, that it would create some sort of self-censorship. But that seems to have just flown out the window. Nobody cares if their name is associated with something that is racist or misogynistic, or, like now it's really great to be anti-trans. I mean, I should jump on that bandwagon, because people seem to just love beating up on the trans people for whatever reason. And it's just, I don't know. I find it all very illogical for a podcast about logic.
Yeah, no, that I actually, going back to, the old days there, I had, the thing about those guys was that I sometimes had lunch with them. They became, I don't want to say they became friends, but, we became people who could sit down and have a conversation, face to face. And the thing is, like, and, we talk about this a lot now with Facebook. You alluded to, how people thought like, oh, that censorship would be there. And, clearly it's not. But I think what happens is that when you meet these people in person, with some exceptions, obviously, but in most cases, they don't come off as their internet, alter ego, in a sense. They certainly, I think, are a little bit more restrained, knowing that they're talking to you in person. Because then, it's one thing to have, the comfort of your keyboard and you're sitting at home, typing whatever you want, but that person's face to face with you. And if you don't know that person well, you don't know how they're going to react. And, I think that's, I did notice that with some of those guys, that they certainly were different when you met up with them in person. But then, you would go home, and a couple hours later, you see their latest post online. You're like, gee, was that the same guy? But it is, that's, and it really, in my job, especially now, I look back on that as like, that was early training for what we see today with, different political topics. And, people on Facebook that just, they sign up with their real name, and they're not afraid to put whatever to their name. And it's like, wow, we thought that this was actually, we had this, discussion at the Citizen where I work, that, for a long time we had a comment section on our website. So every story you go on, there was a comment section, and usually, depending on the topic, there'd be a decent thread there, especially on like crime stories. Everybody wanted to chime in with, oh, what a dirtbag this person is. But we thought because they could sign up with any screen name that, oh, let's shift to Facebook because it'll get better. No, in a lot of ways it got worse. Yeah. Because now they, it's easy for one because it's on Facebook, and, you need an account, but like our website, you have to pay for articles after a time. And so a lot of these people don't subscribe. So the easy way to go is on Facebook, and to them, it doesn't matter. They don't think that anybody's going to catch up with them. And so they'll say anything on it. It's outrageous.
Yeah. I'm coming up with a new name for this, Robert. And maybe you as a journalist can start spreading it. We're going to call it Chihuahua syndrome. And I'll tell you why, because I've got 5 Chihuahuas and I walk them every day. And I'm walking down the street, and here comes this big old pit bull. Okay. This thing could eat my dog in one bite. And my little Chihuahua's barking at them like, man, I'll take you on. Now, one time my next door neighbor had this huge pit bull, and my Chihuahua, he used to go back and forth on his chain or rope or whatever, leash, and he pull it out of my hand so that he could just run off and do what he wanted to do. So he's getting into this barking contest with the next door neighbor's dog, barking up a storm, and then gets off the leash, runs towards it, gets about a foot away, and then just runs back to me yelping and crying. And that's kind of like how these guys are. From a distance, they just sit there and they just... But man, they get too close to the real thing, and they just act like... Yeah, I mean, I used to hang out with those guys too, and I've always had this weird thing, like, especially in a small town, when it comes to politics, a lot of them are very narrow-minded, but as people, they're really good people that would help you if a relative has cancer, or if you need your driveway shoveled. They have this really good heart inside them. But then some other political philosophies I don't necessarily agree with. But I think the group that we're talking about, I mean, these were people that genuinely, for whatever reason, just like to make other people upset. I don't get that mentality. It's not about getting into an intellectual discussion or an argument or anything like that. It's strictly to get a rise out of people, Exactly. And it's just, I don't know. And as much as you and I can sit here and go, yeah, we get it. That's what it is. They're just bullies. We shouldn't care, blah, blah, blah. Man, they're I don't know. They know how to get under my skin still to this day, which is, again, why I had to step away from a lot of the political stuff. But I don't know. And at Facebook, we have this Orleans hub, which is really kind of took over for the Medina Journal-Register. Now, you mentioned Mike Regan, who was our editor. Now, Mike was from, was like from New York City or something, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, I think he was from the Buffalo area originally, but he bounced around. I know he lived in California for a time. I think when he left the Journal, it was to go back to California. I think now he's, I think I saw that he's working for like PBS NewsHour now.
Dude, well, this guy, you'll vouch for me. I mean, this Mike Regan, I mean, you could go into him and go, hey, listen, man, I want to write an article about my next door neighbor being radioactive and killing the entire neighborhood. He'd be like, yeah, go ahead, put it in. I mean, he was so hands off that it was refreshing. And I think I feel like it went both ways though. Like he really wasn't, he didn't really have any leanings, but he couldn't be bullied. Like if people told him that there was a story you didn't want to get covered, he just said, yeah, I don't care. Like we had I don't know, were you around when the police officer was supposedly drinking and ran his car into a wall or something? And then.
That might've been shortly after my time. Yeah. Well, I remember that story.
Yeah. So and everybody was getting on him like, you can't report this story. And it's like, well, how can I not report it? Like everybody in town is talking about it. So we absolutely have to write about it. and he would get all kinds of pressure and things like that and whatever. He's like, yeah, whatever. But he was a pretty good editor. Whereas I think, Tom Rivers, who's the editor of the Orleans Hub, great guy. But I think just because they're advertising based and everything, there's more vanilla in that publication than there is at the Perry's Ice Cream Plant. It's just, there's no attempt in any kind of real discourse just totally plays to the crowd. I think it's disappointing because ultimately the role of the media, and in your role, especially now, that whole concept of watchdog, like if we don't have watchdogs, what do we got? We don't have decent watchdogs. We get guys that get appointed to lieutenant governor who in 3 months get busted for things that clearly they did way before. And you don't have to answer this question, but I would be willing to bet that there were plenty of people that lived in that district, plenty of journalists that lives in that district that weren't all that surprised when those allegations came out.
Yeah, I know for a fact there's one story in particular that I remember, and it was written by The City, which is, a New York City based online publication that's really, grown quickly. An excellent, and they cover more than just city politics. They get into some of the statewide stuff as well. But they wrote a story about this whole kind of shady situation, a long time, relatively speaking, a long time ago, a long time before I think he was even appointed. And so like this idea that like this was a new thing just isn't true. Like this was known that there was something that happened there, between him and this developer, and that, should have been a red flag, but clearly the governor's office completely overlooked it, which is surprising to me. And I must say, one of the stories that I'm working on is actually about, we had a vacancy. Our DA was elected judge to a judgeship and resigned. So yes, there is a structure in place where there's an acting DA, but the governor in New York State has the authority to appoint a DA. The seat would be filled at the next election. That's still a thing, but the governor has that authority. Now, some governors pun on that. They say, well, there's already an acting DA. Why should I get involved? Well, it sounds like that in Cayuga County, they did pitch this idea of appointing someone, and based on some conversations I've had with people, it looks like they had singled someone out as a potential appointee, so to speak, and there was something that was flagged in their background check. So when this news broke, that immediately entered my mind, like we're vetting potential DA appointees better than we're vetting the lieutenant governor. It was kind of eye-opening to me, but yeah, no, it's true. And I think too, communities like Orleans County, there's a lot of what's called news deserts in not just New York, but the country. And even in places where there are media outlets, I think of some communities in the southern tier that have these kind of newspapers that are corporately owned, but they're not staffed well. A lot of the material is written by people in Albany or New York City or whatever. And so they have these like broader stories of regional impact, but not like the hyper local stuff. Like even those publications, like they're missing out on, I'm sure, a lot of great watchdog journalism opportunities. And a lot of it comes down to like, where are you putting your resources? I'm not going to take any shots at Orleans Hub, because I think that their model is basically like, we cover, community events and, some of the bigger news items, like if a fire happens or whatever, but they just don't have the staffing. And
well, I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you right there in that respect, because I don't think they should get a free pass. And I'll give you a recent example. And, either you're going to do it or you're not. You're either going to be a news organization or not. I get it. You got advertising dollars and things like that. So there was a gentleman, I don't know if you heard the story, that was coming to SUNY Brockport. And
oh, yeah.
He is a convicted police killer. And I think ultimately, my wife and I have discussed this. We're SUNY Brockport alumni. Did you go to Brockport?
I went to Fredonia, but
okay, so you're a SUNY
I have
person.
2 sisters that went to Brockport. Yeah.
So it's like, anytime you're a speaker at a place like Brockport, I mean, you're lucky if 9 people show up. And probably 3 of them are high, and nobody, you know what I mean? Like it may, and if that many show up, it's because one professor is like putting pressure on you because you need extra credit and you've skipped your classes for the semester. Okay. So it's like, so anyhow, so this guy comes, he gets booked, and, of course, all the Republican elected officials, they all put out press statements, and Orlean Tubb ran every single one of them. But they never ran a statement from SUNY Brockport saying why they booked that particular individual. Now, whether you agree with SUNY Brockport's decision or not, to me, in only printing press releases from the guys in the political party that's in power, that's, to me, that's bias. I mean, that's overt bias. And it's almost a cop-out because you're saying, well, I didn't write it. It's just a press release, but we're running it. Well, if you're going to get a statement from one side, then you should at least get a balance from the other side. And again, I'm not saying I agree with booking a guy who's convicted of killing a police officer. I don't think it's a great idea. Although, it certainly worked because look at the amount of publicity that they got for this particular speaker. And don't think that this is, I don't think that this is the old cynical Thom talking, but I don't think that there was any like benevolent thing like, oh, we really want to expose racism and, white privilege and all that other stuff. I think it was like, hey man, we want to book a really controversial speaker that's going to get a lot of attention. And that's exactly what happened. And everybody walked into it. And so now it became this event. And as a media person, that the reality is that publicity is publicity. We talked about, I don't know if we ever discussed this in one of our old episodes, but I believe in political campaigns too, going back to that Nate McMurray versus Chris Collins. Well, if Nate McMurray is running an ad that's an attack Chris Collins ad, and then Chris Collins is running a pro Chris Collins ad, everything you hear is Chris Collins, okay? Negative or positive. It's still familiarity. That's the voice that you hear more often. It works. It's effective. Yeah. So on some level, you've got to figure out a way to get your name, the one that's spoke. I mean, Will Smith. I mean, Chris Rock. 2 semi. I don't want to say obscure, but let's face it, they weren't relevant. You and I wouldn't be talking about them at all today if it weren't for the incident at the Academy Awards. But that's what it comes down to. So I mean, again, to circle back to I don't mean to pick on the hub per se. But those are the kinds of things that absolutely drive me crazy because I feel that on some level, like you said, those news deserts, that's where it's like, don't pretend you're a news organization. Then don't run any news. If you're not going to be a news organization, don't run press releases from the state senator or the assembly person unless you have something from the opposition party. But listen, we are at the 58 minute mark. So we're going to end part 1.
Yeah, I think that's where...
So, I mean, if you want, we can come back and do like a part 2, or if you got other things to do, we can reconvene on another day. So I'm giving you an option.
I mean, we can get started. Yeah. I mean, I've got enough time here for
okay. All right.
For half hour or so.
So this will end part 1. We're going to do a part 2 because I figured if Robert and I got together that we would just start talking, which is kind of what we did. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if we if we need to, add to part 2 at another point, we certainly can.
All right. Well, I'm going to end part 1. And so this is where the theme music comes on. I can hear it in my head right now. Oh, there it is. Yes. See, I'm pretending. It's like those guys standing in front of a green screen, pretending they're pointing at a actual map, but they're not. But thanks for listening to this Bagel Logic podcast, part 1 with Robert Harding. And we will be back soon with part 2. That'll actually be another episode, so make sure you check that one out if you liked part 1. And if you didn't like part 1, who knows? Just listen to part 2 and maybe you like it better.